Oh, thank you. Hey, everybody online. We'll get started here in 3-4 minutes, maybe. We're going to give it just a couple more minutes and see if we get these guys back in here. Jeremy's just going to have to join us here when he can. Good evening, everybody. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Kind of a dreary night outside. It's all humid and rainy and blah. It's starting to feel like Houston. Humidity. We're going to do a marathon tonight and try to make it to Ezekiel chapter 24. We'll see if that happens or not. I'm going to try to move kind of quick. We'll see how it goes. And finish up one thing that I mentioned at the end of class last week that I didn't really get explained very fully. So we'll finish that up as well. Let's pray before we get started, and then we'll. God, so thankful for you this evening. Thankful for the opportunity to be together once again. Prayerful for Kenva and her family during this time. Just ask that you would be with them now. And thankful, God, for the opportunity to dig into Ezekiel again. And pray that you'd be with us as we dig through some of this stuff and as we think about its relevance for us today. Pray simply that we know you a little better when we leave than when we came in. In the name of Jesus we pray. Amen. All right. So last week I mentioned in chapter 7 the chapter 7 of Ezekiel, verses 1 and 2. The word of the Lord came to me, and you, O son of man, thus says the Lord God to the land of Israel, an end. The end has come upon the four corners of the land. Now the end is upon you, and I will send my anger upon you. So he starts out here, and he's talking in the present tense as if the end for Jerusalem has already come. He's talking as if like it's already come upon them. But if you look out, if you're standing in Jerusalem when Ezekiel gives this prophecy, chapter 7, then you're kind of like, what are you talking about, Ezekiel? The end hasn't come. Look at us. We're flourishing. In fact, Zedekiah thought they were flourishing, and they talked about how Israel was flourishing. And yet Ezekiel says the end has come. The end is here. It is upon you right now, right here. So this is a concept that we see in Scripture in a lot of different places, especially in apocalyptic literature, which Ezekiel delves into at different points in time. And by apocalyptic literature, I mean kind of like the last half of Daniel, like what we talked about, or Revelation, or even a couple of the other prophets get into it a little bit. There's some of it that's found even in some of Paul's writings, like in Romans. There's a couple of places where he kind of delves into an apocalyptic type style of literature. And Ezekiel does. And one thing that we see in apocalyptic literature is this idea of talking about something as if it has already occurred, even though in the course of history it has not. So in this case, God has spoken judgment, and because he's already spoken it, it's as if it had already come. And the way that I explain this, man, it's thunder. Yeah, my foot was shaking. Like that was some loud thunder. But the way I explain this, my son Jaden, when he was little, it was really, really hard to get him to eat. He's super picky. He gets that from me. I'm a picky eater. I think he's more picky than I am. But also he had a really hard time putting on any weight. Like he was, it was sort of a big deal when he was younger for a little while. So I'm always dinner time was a battle because he wouldn't want to eat anything, and we'd make him sit there. It was just it wasn't any fun, right? So we're eating dinner one evening. I think we were having like scrambled eggs and toast and bacon, and I don't know. It was like breakfast for dinner. I'm sitting next to him, and man, just eat something, right? And he looks over at my plate, and he sees the piece of toast on my plate, and he says, "My toast." Now, I'm thinking, oh, well, I kind of wanted that piece of toast, but he needs to eat. So I'm marking this toast as his. Now, he didn't immediately take it off my plate. It sat on my plate. He had declared it as his own, and I treated it on my plate as if it was his and as if he had already eaten it. I didn't touch it, right? Even though it was presently, in the present, still on my plate. It was no longer mine, even though it was still on my plate. This is this concept that I'm talking about, this idea of God declaring something in the present that is to come in the future, but it's like it's already there. The big theological term for this is up here. Oh, I forgot to turn the projector on. Yeah, it's the black one up there. You're going to have to hit the on button about 20 times, Jeremy. It doesn't like the remote. The big theological term is proleptic eschatological expectation. 3 big words. Well, 2 big words. Expectation, we know, right? You're looking forward to something happening. Or you're maybe not looking forward to it, but something's about to happen. You expect that it's going to happen, yeah. Proleptic simply means before, and eschatological just means end things, things of the end. So declaring something in advance about the end that you're expecting to happen is sort of the definition here. Declaring something in advance. Oh, that's not even the right. Huh. I don't know what's going on there. That's weird. That's not where it should be. I don't know what's going on. Proleptic eschatological expectation. My slides are messed up tonight, apparently. We'll just go back here. So it's this idea that God declares something. It hasn't happened yet, but it's been declared, so you can expect that it's going to happen. In fact, you can even live as if it was already happening in some way, shape, or form. It's sort of like the idea of a zombie. We talked about this briefly last week. They're not dead, but they're walking around. They look like they're alive, but they're really dead. It's that kind of concept. Romans chapter 1 is a really good example of this. Romans chapter 1, verse 18. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. So Paul's writing, he says, the wrath of God is revealed from heaven. Now, has the wrath of God rained down upon the people to whom he's writing? No. But are they under the wrath of God? Yes, unless they're believers in Jesus, right? So that's one example. So here Ezekiel talks in the present tense about something that is about to happen, hasn't happened yet, but he's talking as if it already has. So Jerusalem is as good as dead, we could say. They're the walking dead in a way. So that chapter 7. So chapters 8 through 11, they're going to talk about specifically about the temple. Going to talk about a couple of other things in there as well, but they're specifically going to be talking about the temple. These prophecies that Ezekiel gives were intended for a specific audience, the elders of Judah, the elders of the exiles from Judah, I should say, have gathered at Ezekiel's house. They've probably come to him hoping for some word of comfort from this prophet. Not what they get. And not only are they to whom this vision is related by Ezekiel, is told by Ezekiel, but the vision it includes and is against these elders who are sitting at his feet, hoping for a good word too. So this vision, it opens with a date, and we can date it pretty close. September 18th, 592 BC. It's crazy how specific Ezekiel gets with some of his dates. So it's about 14 months since the very first vision of the book. And Ezekiel has probably just completed or is very close to the completion of the 390 days and the 40 days that he's laying on his side and bearing the sins and laying siege to the Jerusalem that he's built. And the structure of 8 through 11 tells us that these 4 chapters really are all about the location of the presence of God. Remember back in chapter 1 when we had the vision of the 4 living creatures, and there were the wheels, and it was moving in every direction, basically. Just this idea that the presence of God was on the move. Well, 8 through 11 is going to say this same thing for us again. It's also going to tell us why the presence of God is on the move. Why he's no longer willing to reside in the temple. Why he's no longer willing to be among his people there. So there's this structure, and it repeats itself. So if you see like and then A apostrophe, we call that A prime. So A and A prime at the beginning and at the end of this section. You've got an introduction to the vision, you've got a conclusion to the vision, and they both reference what? Glory, the divine glory of God. And then this one, instead of, a lot of times it'll be like, sort of like this, where A and A prime, B and B prime, where they sort of, like it goes up and then comes back. Well, this time it goes up and then it goes up again, basically, except for the beginning and the end that sort of bookends this section. And we talked about glory, how that's sort of like God being revealed in a particular place, a revealing, something that was hidden is brought out into the open, something that was unknown is made known. So glory has to do with presence in a very big way. So we've got these 4 visions of abominations. There's accusations. They center on the elders, and then again in 11:1 through 6, you've got more accusation of social wrongdoing that centers on the leaders, and then C corresponds with C prime, and it's the same thing. It's thing over and over again. And it centers on this idea of the presence of God and where God is going to choose to dwell, and where he's very specifically going to choose not to dwell, where he's not going to be. The chapter 8, we've got these 4 visions to the temple, basically, to Jerusalem and to the temple. And the first vision is of an idol of jealousy at the north gate of the city. And this idol is in the shape of a human being. So there's a statue there in the shape of a human being. It's most likely the Canaanite goddess Asherah. If you read through the Old Testament, you're going to see Baal over and over again, and you're going to see Asherah over and over again. One very visible aspect of worship of Asherah that you see is the Ashtoreth poles. And those would be sites where people would gather together and do all sorts of crazy things and worship Asherah. So there's this idol. It's at the north gate, and the north traditionally the position from which Jerusalem's enemies attack. So they come from the north. So this idol is probably there. Intended to help guard the city from attack. They're hoping that this statue of Asherah is going to help guard Jerusalem from attack. Ironically, it's God who. And you remember in chapter 1, where was the big storm coming from? From the north. It's coming from the north. God's on the attack. And this lifeless idol is not going to be able to stop him. God's provoked to jealousy. Deuteronomy 32:16, same thing. God is jealous of his people doing other things and giving their lives over to other things and giving their love and their belongings and everything that they have to other things. The next that you have in chapter 8, you have these 70 elders of the house of Israel, and they're kind of leaders among the lay community. They're probably not priests. They're not like advisors to the king necessarily. They're elders. They're leaders in the community, and they are offering incense to idols in a secret chamber somewhere. So what's being done in public at a distance from the temple is also being done in private at the entrance of the temple courtyard. This is happening at the entrance of the temple courtyard. The first one was probably a Canaanite form of worship of Asherah, a Canaanite god. This one is probably some Egyptian form of worship, and they're probably trying to ward off dangers from like demonic forces or something along those lines. It's a very, very sharp contrast. Exodus 24, 1 through 11, 70 elders of Israel who are privileged with seeing God. And then in Numbers 11, 16 through 3, these 70 elders are given the same spirit that Moses is given. So it's very much in contrast to these 70 elders when Israel was wandering around in the desert. Those 70 elders, they're doing okay. These 70 elders, not so much. Ironically, God tells Ezekiel what they've been saying. He says, "The Lord does not see us. The Lord has forsaken the land." That's what these elders are saying. And God is showing Ezekiel that, in fact, he does see them because he hears exactly what they're saying, and Ezekiel sees them saying it. Also, maybe ironically, God hasn't abandoned the land. They have driven him away, is the idea that we get. Chapter 8, verse 6. incense burning doesn't ward off dangers, it is actually the causes of God's impending judgment. So it has the opposite effect. It's bringing doom upon them as opposed to warding off things that are going to harm them. The next vision is there's some women who are weeping for this thing called Tammuz at the north gate of the temple itself. So not the north gate of the city like the first one, but the north gate of the temple. Tammuz was a Babylonian ritual. It marked the death and descent of a god they worshipped called Dumuzi into the underworld. So he'd die, he'd go down into the underworld, and then he would come back to life and return, and that's when all the lands and the harvest and everything became fertile. So it was sort of with the rhythm of nature, with seasons, and he would die, descend into the underworld, and then come back, and that would make all their land fertile. So this act of mourning was supposed to sort of counteract this death and hasten his return. So these women are mourning so that this god Tammuz can return from the underworld. That's their belief. That's why they're mourning this ritual, I guess we could call it. So their lamenting for the dead had been substituted for the worship of the living God. They're mourning for the dead. They're lamenting for the dead and hoping that they'll come back to life instead of worshiping the living God. There's a very stark contrast there. And then lastly, there's this supreme act of idolatry court of the temple. So we started at the city gates, and then we got a little bit closer to the temple, and then we got a little bit closer to the temple, and now we're inside the inner courts of the temple. So closer and closer and closer to the place where God descended among his people and stayed. And in this inner court, there's 25 men there, and they have literally turned their backs on the temple, and they're laying themselves down flat on the ground, prostrate, faces on the ground, to the east in worship of the sun. They are literally turning their backs on God and worshiping the sun instead of him, right in front of the place where God had graced them enough to dwell among them. And so God lets them. He lets them. There's this. We're going to see this same thing in several times in Romans chapter 1, same place that we just were. So God makes himself known, chapter 1, verses 18 through 20, 18 through 20-ish, 21. They knew God, but they didn't honor him. So they became fools. They exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images representing mortal man and birds and animals. So instead of worshiping God, they worshiped the things that he created. Therefore, verse 24, God gave them up. And then he says some more stuff. Verse 26, for this reason, God gave them up. It says some more stuff. Verse 28, since they did not see fit to acknowledge God, God gave them up. He let them have what they were seeking after. And in this case, Israel was seeking after lifeless idols. And so God let them have lifeless idols because they turned their back on him. He gave them over. That's kind of the idea of what's happening here. So Ezekiel, he sees this very comprehensive nature of Jerusalem. They extend outside the city gate all the way to the inner courtyard of the temple itself. It involves men, it involves women, it involves elders, and it involves idolatry that's been imported from all sorts of the surrounding nations, from Canaan, from Israel, from Babylon. It's comprehensive, what's going on there. So chapter 9, there's these 6 executioners, agents of destruction, and they're going to strike Jerusalem without pity or compassion. Thank you. You just keep telling me that. Keep telling me that. So they're going to strike without pity or compassion, and it's kind of, if you read their language very carefully, this is a reenactment of the first Passover. Remember Passover? When the Israelites were in Egypt, the 10th plague, or the 11th plague, and they marked their doors with the blood, and God's angel of destruction passes over those who have their doors marked with the blood. The same language is used here, except that instead of Egypt is Judah, who's going to be devastated. The 6 agents of destruction are to pass through or pass over. They're not going to pass over, they're going to pass through the city, slaughtering to destruction anyone who does not bear the mark. So it's very much a sort of the same language used in the Passover there, probably meant to recall that, except this time God's not passing over, he's passing through, or his agents of destruction are. So slaughter is going to begin at the temple with the chief idolaters, these ones who are standing right in front of the temple, and killing is going to take place even in the temple, which is a big deal because you didn't shed blood like inside the temple. You offered sacrifices, but you didn't shed human blood. But it's been the idea here is that the temple has already been so defiled by all the other things that are going on there that God just says, it doesn't even matter if there's more defilement that goes on here. It's already been so defiled. That's how bad it's gotten. So it's sort of the idea, we talked about it in Amos. Amos goes up to Israel. He's prophesying there, and the head priest in Israel says, "Go away, Amos. We don't want to hear anything you have to say." So the most religious person in all of Israel says, "Forget you, Amos." And so at that point, Amos, there's no argument from him coming against Israel. He says it's all just, it's gone. It's gone. If even the most religious person here is that bad, man. Same concept here. If even those who are in the inner courtyard of the temple, the most religious person in all of Jerusalem, if they are worshiping their son and literally turning their backs on God in front of his very presence, then there must not be any true worship left anywhere in Israel. That's the picture that we hear. Is basically the same vision as chapter 1, but it's much sharper focus than chapter 1. In fact, even in chapter 1, Ezekiel calls them the 4 living creatures. He doesn't call them the cherubim, right? Well, in chapter 10, he's having this same vision. It's at a later time. God gives it to him again, but he sees it in much sharper focus, and he realizes, oh, those are the cherubim. And he calls them the cherubim. So it's very much a similar kind of vision, and it just tells in a more detailed sort of way what's happening here. So this divine chariot, it draws up on the south side of the temple, and it's basically as far away from the abomination. You remember it started at the north all the idols, and it went south. So pulls up on this, or this chariot pulls up on the south side of the temple, far away as it can get from all the abominations that are more on the north side. And cloud fills the inner court. So he comes out of the Holy of Holies, fills the inner court. The glory of God is on the move. It departs very slowly, as if he's reluctant to leave. This is where he's been for some time among his people, and it's probably, he seems reluctant to leave, but he eventually makes it to the chariot. He moves past the east gate, then past the Mount of Olives, east of Jerusalem. He's outside the city limits, and God's left the building. He's left the building. Can't be there, where all these detestable things are going on over and over and over and over and over again for years and years and years and years and years and years and years. So the city's doomed. It's now cut off from its true protector, God, and God abandons the city to the idols. They wanted the idols. They thought the idols would protect them, so he lets them have what they wanted. And unfortunately, lifeless statues don't offer much hope, do they? That'll preach. That's a, how often do we see people turn towards this or turn towards that, and when they really need to be turning towards God, when they're going through something, or when they're struggling with something, or just whatever's happening, and the things they turn to are lifeless, and they offer no hope. But God will eventually let people have what they want. Chapter 11. Let's see. That's very close, Kenva. It's proleptic. 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 The last slide from the last week's slides is what it is. So I think I sent those around in an email for everybody. It's that last slide. So proleptic, proleptic. Chapter 11. We're going to talk about some counselors. There's this small council of high officials to the... Where are you at? You're supposed to help me. So there's this small council of officials that are officials to the king. They're counselors of the king. They're advisors of the king. And in Judah, during this period of time, they had a lot of power. Zedekiah, he was a weak king. And so their powers were extended pretty big in the face of his weakness. So Ezekiel has this vision. There's meat being thrown into the fire. And then there's some stuff like the not as good stuff. There's meat being thrown into a cooking pot, but then there's some other meat being thrown into the fire. Is kind of what's happening here. Have you ever heard the phrase "out of the frying pan and into the fire"? Yeah, the frying pan isn't a very good place to be, but it's better than in the fire, isn't it? Maybe. That's sort of the concept here. The cooking pot is not a very good place to be, but it's better than being the scraps that are absolutely useless and being thrown into the fire. That's what Ezekiel's vision is about here. So these Jerusalem and still in the city, they think of themselves as like the true remnants, and those who are in exile are under God's judgment. But God rejects that claim. It says the leaders who are in the city right now, you who think that that you're doing okay and that you're not under God's judgment like everybody else out there, guess what? You're going to be taken out of the cooking pot, the boiling water, and you're going to be thrown out of the city. You're going to be thrown into the fire. So that's sort of the first part of chapter 11 there, and then the second half, 14 through 25. It's Ezekiel and his fellow exiles. He's going to say, who, even though they've been sent really far away from the land of Israel, they have not been cast out of the Lord's presence. It's kind of what we talked about with that chariot with the 4 living creatures being on the move, and that chariot is out there where Ezekiel is, and it's this this idea that God leaves the temple, but he's still there with these exiles who are in the countryside of Babylon. In fact, he says that he's been a sanctuary for them in the countries where they've gone. What's a sanctuary? It's like a temple, right? So for them, it would have been like God was their sanctuary. So he was. Jerusalem is not just a departure from Jerusalem, it is a departure to Babylon. So he's not just leaving, he's leaving to go somewhere specific. And he's leaving to go among the exiles who everybody else in Jerusalem said, God's judgment fell on them, that's why they're exiled. But that's not the case, God says. And then he comes back and he says, now we're getting just a little bit, every once in a while he's going to sprinkle in just a little bit of a glimmer of hope. Once we get, next week we get 25 and on, especially like 33 and on, we're going to start seeing Ezekiel talk in a much more hopeful kind of tone. We don't get much of that in the first 24 chapters. It's kind of doom and gloom. But we get just a little bit of a glimmer of hope every once in a while in the middle of this. Jerusalem is going to fall. And what we get here towards the end of chapter 11 is that this exile, it's temporary. His people who've been scattered, they're going to be brought back. They're going to be redeemed, and all the idols and images that are there now, they're going to be removed. And we're going to start again. We're going to start anew. We're going to start afresh. I'm going to be your God. You're going to be my people. That kind of talk. So it's not going to be fun, but I'm not going to totally and completely destroy everybody. It's going to be a remnant, and they're going to come back into the land. They're going to come back into my presence. 1 through 24, basically, he is saying the same thing over and over and over again in different ways. Basically, like think. Let's say you were going to do a sermon series on one particular topic, and every week, basically, you were saying the same thing about that particular topic, but you said it in just a little bit different kind of way. Or let's say you're giving one sermon, and you give one example about what you're talking about that has a point, and then you give another example that makes exactly the same point, but you tell it through two different stories. And some people in the audience are going to go, oh, when you tell that first story. And then some other people are going to go, oh, I get what you're saying now when you tell that second. That's what Ezekiel's doing. He's giving the same prophecy over and over and over again about the fall of Jerusalem. He's just telling it in different ways and telling different parts of the story. So don't get confused as we're reading this that, okay, this is going to happen, and then this is going to happen, and this is going to happen. And no, it's all talking about the same event. He's just telling the same story in different ways at different points in time leading up to it is kind of what's happening. So chapter 12, Judah's captivity is symbolized here. Kind of like Jerusalem, Ezekiel's fellow exiles are rebellious. They don't understand what God's been showing them because of their rebellion. So he's going to do this sign act thing like he does a lot. And he does this sign act of the exile. Then there's an interpretation of this sign act that he did. And then there's a second sign act of fear and trembling. And the dominant theme throughout this, you're going to see it said several times, is of looking but not seeing. Looking but not seeing. So Ezekiel, he's going to carry out these sign acts as people watch. And this first one depicts an event that the exiles had already taken part in. So he's doing this thing in front of them, and he's basically telling them the story of their exile. They went through this. It's the most terrible experience probably that they've ever been through in their life, and he's acting it out in front of them. They're watching, and they don't know what he's talking about. It would have been pretty clear to them, it should have been pretty clear to them what he was doing. He was acting out their story. And yet they didn't see. And that's the theme of this whole chapter, is looking but not seeing. Jesus said that several times, right? That you're going to hear but not hear. Same thing here. They don't understand what he's doing or talking about. They saw it with their own eyes, but they don't get the message. Chapter 12, verse 27, towards the end here. The vision, so Ezekiel's been prophesying, right? And so we're going to talk later about some false prophets and what people thought about different prophets and things that they were saying. 12:27, the vision he sees is for many years from now, and he prophesies about the distant future. So he's saying all these things, and they don't understand that he's saying it directly to them. They're saying, yeah, probably what he's saying is right, and it's going to come to pass, but it's for some future generation. It's not for us. How often do we sit in an auditorium and listen to a sermon or listen to a message or listen to a class, and the first thing that we think about is, oh, you know what? That person over there really needs to hear this lesson. I'm going to pay attention so I can tell them about this lesson. Or, hey, they need to hear that. Be humble. Yeah, that person over there really needs to. We can understand the sentiment a little bit, right? When somebody starts preaching, our first reaction sometimes is to think about everybody else who needs to hear the message instead of myself. That's what's happening here with these people to whom Ezekiel is doing this stuff in front of. So ultimately, this vision has to do with Zedekiah, with the king. They're going to bring him to Babylon. You remember what Nebuchadnezzar did to Zedekiah? Gouged out his eyes. You're going to bring him to Babylon, but he won't see it, Ezekiel says. He literally did not see it because Nebuchadnezzar gouged out his eyes. So then Ezekiel eats and drinks with trembling and shuddering, depicting the anxiety that the inhabitants of Jerusalem are going to have. Again, the land of Judah, all who remain in it, they're doomed. They're just the same story over and over and over again here. Chapter 12, 21 through 13, 23 is going to talk about these false prophets of Israel. Note that he calls them prophets of Israel and not prophets of God. Prophets of Israel, not prophets of God. How do we distinguish between true and false prophecy? Say what? Okay, yeah, so once it happens, then you know whether it was true or false. Number one, that was a test for a prophet that we're given, right? What's that? By his truth. Yeah, I think today, like let's say somebody walks up to me and they say, I've got a message for you from God. And the message for me from God is that I need to go and murder that person over there. They get a message from God for me? No. Why? Because it's not consistent with His Word, right? Anytime, I think we can test, even today, we can test things that people say by Scripture. If something doesn't line up, then it probably wasn't something that you heard from God. By His fruits. Yeah, absolutely. Very good. By His fruits. Oh, yes. 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 Which is exactly what they were doing. They were doing that too back then. These false prophets of Israel, they would just tell people what they wanted to hear. They wouldn't tell them the truth. They'd say, yeah, everything's wonderful and great, and God says, keep on going the way that you're going. And it wasn't. And there were these conflicting messages, because you had people like Jeremiah and Ezekiel who were saying, we're doomed. We're doomed. And then other prophets are saying, who are claiming that their prophecies are from God, are saying, oh, no, it's all good. It's all good. And there's this confusion and conflicting stories from people claiming to be prophets that created a lot of cynicism, created a lot of confusion, a lot of false comfort that brought about some very catastrophic results. Very catastrophic results. What would have happened if all of the prophets in Israel or in Judah leading up to that time, if they would have sought out God before they started just throwing a bunch of stuff out there, and that they actually proclaimed what God wanted proclaimed to His people? I wonder if Judah would have been in a different place. I wonder what that says about the importance of truth-telling in our messages and in conversations with people today. I come back to this over and over and over again. I'm so amazed. John chapter 4, this Samaritan woman comes to Jesus, and He tells her about herself. She said, He told me everything that I ever did, and it was embarrassing stuff. But He did it in such a way that made this woman want to run into town to tell everyone there that she'd met a man who told her everything that she'd ever done. You need to come and meet him too. He spoke truth, but He did it in such a way that drew her closer instead of making her go further away. There's something to be said about, there's this song by this group, a cappella, teaching the truth in love. Teaching the truth in love. These prophets here were not doing that. They weren't doing it. They were just telling everybody what they wanted to hear. There wasn't truth in that. And that doesn't help anybody. Didn't help them. Not one bit. Chapter 14, 1 through 11, there's these idolatrous elders. They're basically going through the motions. They come to Ezekiel, they're inquiring of him, probably hoping for a word of comfort. They're just going through the motions, making it look like they're seeking God, like they're inquiring of God, they're seeking Him. But really, they walk away from there and they're worshiping other idols. Their hearts aren't in it, is kind of the picture that we get. They're trying to serve two masters. Doesn't work very well. 14:12 through 23. There's there are four stories here, kind of test cases, case studies, maybe you could call them. There's a famine, one there's wild beasts, another there's a sword, another there's a plague, and there's these three righteous men, Noah, Daniel, and Job. Each of them are noted for their righteous behavior in the middle of a very corrupt generation. There's some conversation about if this is actually like Daniel in the Bible Daniel or a different Daniel. It doesn't really matter for the sake of what the story that Ezekiel's telling, because the same concept applies. It's a righteous man among a corrupt people. So these four stories, the presence of these three men, like very, 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 very righteous men, will not save everyone else around them. It won't save their children. It won't save their parents. It won't save their brothers or their sisters. It won't save any of their countrymen. The presence of these three righteous men will not keep the disaster from coming. And that's sort of the concept of what's happening in Jerusalem. Even if, Ezekiel says, even if Noah and Daniel and Job, three incredibly righteous men, show up in the middle of Jerusalem, it will not stop this disaster from coming. It won't. Their righteousness doesn't help you who are completely and totally unrighteous. So there's this sense of individual responsibility here that you see. You're responsible for your own righteousness, is what we see here. There's going to be some who survive, though, this chapter says. There's going to be some who are brought out of the ruins, but it's not because of their own righteousness, interestingly enough. They're going to survive so that they can then go into exile, and the exiles can see just how bad Jerusalem's sinfulness was. Because these people are going to come out, they're going to survive it, and they are unrighteous, wicked, seeking everything but God kind of people. And so there's going to be some people survive, but they're going to survive so that all the exiles can know, oh, that's why you did it, God. Because if these are the best of what was in there, then wow. So chapters 15 through 19, we'll do this really quick. These are all allegories or metaphors. He's going to give an allegory or a metaphor or a parable even, they're called. And then he's going to go and explain what they mean. Some of them are completely and totally in your face, and he's going back and forth between the metaphor and what the metaphor is about the whole time. Sometimes he gives the metaphor and then he explains it. So chapter 15, he's talking about this useless vine. These prunings are going to be cut from a vine. It's going to be pruned, so the leftover pieces, they're not good for anything, right? They're useless, so you burn them. But sometimes when you throw a stick in the fire, it doesn't burn all the way, right? So there's a piece in the middle that doesn't burn all the way, he says. So you pick it out and, oh, okay, this is still useless. It can't be used for anything. Throw it back in the fire for it to burn up completely. So this is a metaphor of Jerusalem, who's not good for anything. The first burning was the initial defeat of Judah in 597, when Ezekiel and others were sent into exile. But that one, it didn't achieve any purpose at all. There was no redemptive purpose. In fact, the people they're more useless than they were before, so they're just chunked back on the fire to be burned up completely. It's kind of the idea. Chapter 16 is this metaphor about a faithless bride. It sounds a lot like like Hosea, the first little bit of Hosea. It's a very similar kind of metaphor. God comes and gives life to this city that was nothing and hopeless and helpless. This city and its people. He spreads the corner of his robe over her, affirming her as his bride. And it's this true love match on his part. He loves them. He provides this wardrobe fit for a queen. But instead of remembering it was God who gave her these blessings, they take all those blessings and give them to all these lifeless statues and idols. And they lust after these other things. The language of lust becomes very, very strong in this chapter. And so her lovers, they're going to be gathered and destroy her. Babylon is going to gather and destroy her. The metaphor shifts to mother and daughter. You are the daughter of your mother, Ezekiel says. Your sisters are Samaria and Sodom. What happened to Samaria? Wiped out. What happened to Sodom? Wiped out. Those are your sisters. But Samaria, Sodom, they'll be restored. They'll break, again, a little bit of glimmer of hope. And God will honor his covenant and establish an everlasting covenant. Beautiful verse. An everlasting covenant. Chapter 17, there's 2 eagles and a vine. This is Babylon, Judah, and Egypt that are being talked about here. And a cedar. And it's sort of a metaphor within a metaphor here. So it's talking about Babylon and Judah and Egypt. But then through the language you see that that it's a metaphor for God taking care of Judah and them reaching out to other kings instead of God. So it's like a metaphor within a metaphor. 2 metaphors. Chapter 18 is all about individual responsibility. Some people among the exiles in Judah, they're saying, we're paying the price for what our fathers did. We're being judged because of their sins. And God says, no. No, you're not. You're being judged for your sins. Not so fast. You're guilty of exactly the same things. Take some responsibility for your actions. Lots of ways you can think about it. If God is judging this generation for their father's sins, like if we're going to be judged anyways because our parents messed up, then, what's the point of even trying to please God? There's no point because we're being judged for somebody else. So, and God through Ezekiel says, no, the responsibility is on your shoulders. It's on your shoulders. You could have turned away from the sins of your father, or vice versa. There's 3 generations that are talked about. There's a righteous father, a terrible, awful son who does exactly the opposite of his father, and then the son of that son sees the wickedness of his father and turns away, and is okay because of that. But so the whole message is, no, you're responsible. You're responsible. That's a longer conversation if we had some time, but in a nutshell, that's what it is. Chapter 19, you've got this another funeral lament dirge kind of deal. Again, you're sort of like the woe oracles, even though the word woe is not used. This is like sort of like hearing your eulogy before your own funeral. And it's not going back and recounting all the good things from your life, like what you get when you go to a funeral most of the time, right? You go to a funeral and people tell wonderful stories about the person who the funeral is for. But in this case, this funeral lament is recounting lots of terrible things. It involves 2 lions and a vine. Chapter 20, 1 through 44. We're now in the summer of 591 BC. We're getting closer and closer to the fall of Jerusalem. Elders, there's elders in the exilic community, just like there were in Judah. They've been assembled before Ezekiel of the Lord. They're seeking God, but they're seeking God sort of not seeking other things in his place. They're continuing to do that, to seek other things. They continue to worship idols. So God's not going to answer them. He's not going to answer them. There's, again, three stories told of three different generations of people. These are generations. The first generation is the one that lived in Egypt during the Exodus. The second generation is those who are in the desert, wandering around in the desert. The generation is their children. And they all go through this same sort of six-part. There's this, God reveals himself to them. He challenges them to this exclusive devotion, this exclusive relationship with God. I'm your God, you will be my people. We have the covenant, exclusive relationship with each other. Israel rebels. There's a threat of God's wrath in some way, shape, or form. This wrath, though, is limited or deferred. God, for the sake of God's name. And then there's some sort of act of limited judgment. So he singles out a particular law, the Sabbath, to talk about these generations and how they rebel. So we can talk all day about the Sabbath, but it was foundational to Israel's view of sacred time, a sacred community. It also cut across. So the pagans, they all had nature-based or non-godly nations. They had this nature-based calendar. It revolved completely around the phases of the moon and agricultural seasons. And so the Sabbath, it also called God's people to sort of march to the beat of a different drum, you could say. Instead of doing their lives around the moon and the rain and all these other things that people worshipped, they did their lives on a different schedule, one that God gave them. So a sign of their liberation from bondage. It's what we're told in Leviticus, in Exodus when the Ten Commandments are given. And it's a sign of their distinctiveness from other nations. You are distinctive. You're not to be like the other nations. You're mine. And you're to show everybody that you're mine and that you're different. But they abandoned this. And to abandon this was to abandon their distinctiveness, to abandon this exclusive devotion that they had been called to, this exclusive relationship with God. So Israel continues to rebel. So what should they expect from God? Well, the answer is given in 32 through 44 of chapter 20, and it's sort of surprising. Even though it's kind of, you already see it in this account that Ezekiel's been giving of Israel's history, God will not completely and utterly destroy his people. But he's going to fulfill his original purposes when he chose them out of all the people in the world. He's going to establish this people, this remnant, this purified people to worship him. And he's not going to do it because of any merit on Israel's part, but simply for the sake of his own name. Which I think is an important aspect for us to get. What's the very first of the Ten Commandments? How do the Ten Commandments start? Say what? Okay, yeah, one God. There is one God. That's where we normally think they start. You know how they start? Check this out. Before God ever gives a command, you've heard me say it before, huh? Nope, Exodus. Exodus chapter 20. And God spoke all these words, saying, this is the beginning of the Ten Commandments. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. And then he says, you shall have no other gods before me. He says, I am your God, before he ever gives them a command. Isn't that something? He did not call them into relationship with him because they were these incredible righteous people. He commanded them to be so because they were already in a relationship with him. Which is our New Testament story too, isn't it? While we were still sinners, Christ died for us. He didn't die because we're so righteous. He died because we're so not. And that same story is present in the Old Testament too, when you see God calling an unrighteous people into relationship with him, from that relationship becoming righteous people through their relationship with God. And that's the same message that we have here in chapter 20. It says, there's going to be a new Exodus. There's going to be a new group of people. There's going to be a remnant. And I'm going to call you into it, not because of your merit, not because you've done things great, but because of my name. And that's who I am. I'm a God who establishes relationship with my creation. Let's see. Give me about 3 more minutes. So the end of chapter 20 through 20 talks about the sword that's going to come against Jerusalem. Chapter 22, he's going to give all kinds of reasons for why this judgment's coming. This isn't just out of thin air. God didn't just wake up and get mad one day. There's some reasons why this divine judgment is coming, why it has been coming for a very, very long time. Chapter 23 is another allegory, metaphor type kind of chapter. It's a tale of two sisters, Samaria and Jerusalem. And unfortunately, Jerusalem learns absolutely nothing from watching the fall of her sister. Samaria, or Israel, the northern kingdom, they fell. Judah watched that. At the end of was it the end of Amos, where he says all this stuff is written down so that we can learn from it. Basically, I'm summarizing there. But this stuff wasn't written down so that you could repeat the same mistakes, so you can look at their mistakes and do it different. Well, Judah doesn't do it different. In fact, chapter 23 says they do it even worse than their sister Samaria. They watched their fall, and then they did all the things they did to a greater degree. Chapter 24, finally the siege against Jerusalem has begun. January 15th, 587 BC. January 15th, 587 BC, the siege has begun. Word comes to Ezekiel. The siege began. Nebuchadnezzar is laying siege to Jerusalem. And then the end of 24, we've got Ezekiel's wife that we briefly talked about. And I've got a whole write-up of it in here. I don't really have time to read it. I thought it was really good. One thing to note is that Ezekiel is not permitted to mourn publicly in the traditional ways, but he is, he can groan quietly. Meaning he can mourn in private. So it's not that he can't mourn at all. It's that he's not to be doing it in public ways with lamenting and with tears and messed up clothing and special food that he eats and shaving his head, like all those traditional, putting on sackcloth all the time. But outwardly he's supposed to go about his business, basically. And the idea here, so this is another very serious sign act, right? Ezekiel experiences this great and terrible loss, and it's the same loss that people in Judah have also experienced. And I thought this was really good. The temple in Jerusalem was their pride and joy. It had become as precious to the Jerusalemites as the closest of family members. This building, the delight of their eyes, will be desecrated by God. It will be destroyed along with the sons and the daughters whom the exiles left behind. Yet the people will not weep or wail or mourn publicly for the temple. This is not because of any absence of grief on their part, so they're grieving, even though they've lost so much, but because in the face of such a devastating, all-encompassing judgment, the usual social structures of mourning rites will be overwhelmed. They won't even begin to help people mourn. That's kind of the idea. The normal channels of community support will be gone in the face of such universal loss, and only inward grief will be possible. They're losing, they lose everything. They lose it all. And nobody knows how to mourn for something like that, is sort of the idea here. The normal conventions just don't do it. They don't cover it. And so Ezekiel's asked to sort of represent of his wife, that sort of incomparable loss. And that's what it's like for Jerusalem. The system for dealing with pain and tragedy will not even begin to suffice for this people, is kind of the idea. So that's 1 through 24. And they're difficult. They talk about some difficult stuff, but don't worry. There's going to be some hope. And we'll try to finish up Ezekiel next week. Cool? All right. Thanks, everybody. We just did how many chapters was that? 16? Woo! Man, 16 chapters in an hour? Never. Yep.
Have a good night, guys.
You too.